was an extraordinary visit. They talked about how far would it be possible to include the new Russia in Western structures. And the thing that Putin wanted to talk about was a new relationship between the new Russia and NATO.
Blair was even talking to Iran.
I spoke to President Khatami of Iran. I remember doing that, I think, from the aeroplane, and just, saying this was something we had to be in together, and actually it was a perfectly good conversation, and Iran at that point was prepared to be part of this. I mean, I think there was the possibility then of constructing a very broad consensus of support.
Kabul fell on November the 13th. At that moment, Blair was at the height of his influence as an international statesman, as Britain's Foreign Secretary recalls.
In one sense, Tony was self-nominated, but there wasn't anybody else who got in his way. Tony was able to assume a leadership role, and he was mockingly called the deputy leader of the world, but there was a quite substantial truth in that.
But for Bush and Blair, Afghanistan was not the end of the war on terror. The Americans soon had their sights on a trio of rogue nations: North Korea, Iran, and Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
It quickly became clear Saddam Hussein was the next on the list. America's allies had been ready to take part in the operation against Afghanistan, but many could not see the logic of attacking Iraq. Now the international coalition Blair had put together came under serious strain.
We saw from the very beginning Iraq as a big mistake. Why now Iraq? The Kurds were well protected by a British and American Air Force. They lived under almost in the status of independence, and the massacres in the South took place years ago.
For the Americans, for President Bush, 9/11 changed the world, and the way the Americans view the world, and the way they related to the world. And I think that came as a bit of a shock.
Britain's man at the UN was also puzzled by the focus on Iraq.
I was very surprised by it then, because I didn't think it was that relevant to 2001, and I didn't think it was a proposal that could actually be followed through and done successfully. But that was my first impression, so I was quite shocked by it.
Over the winter of 2001, 2002, the focus in the war on terror somehow shifts to Iraq. Why did that happen?
Basically, I took the view after September the 11th that we had to alter completely our view about nuclear, chemical, biological weapons proliferation. That if we ever ended up in a situation where terrorists were able to gain access to these weapons, then they would use them. Because to me, the most important aspect of September the 11th, apart from the obvious human tragedy, was the fact that they killed 3,000 people, but if they'd been able to kill 30,000, that would have been better for them.
For Blair, Saddam was a danger who could no longer be ignored. Others felt the Americans were exploiting an opportunity.
The 11th of September changed the calculus of what was achievable in politics. That didn't mean to say that Iraq was connected to 2001. It just opened up possibilities where the American people would go with hard American action.
Some saw oil as a decisive factor.
It was about the idea that Saddam was weak. It was an oil-rich country in a perfect strategic position. If we overthrow this rotten dictatorship, this would be the perfect beginning of a chain of reactions in a positive direction.
There were 3 key meetings between Bush and Blair on the road to war in Iraq. The first occurred at the president's ranch a year before the invasion.
I'm going to put to you that At or around the time you went to visit President Bush at the Crawford Ranch in Texas, you secretly agreed that you would support an invasion of Iraq. Is that true?
It is complete rubbish that when I went to see President Bush at the ranch in Crawford in April 2002, that I said, right, okay, I'm up for it. What's more, he was not of that view at that time.
So what was discussed and decided at Crawford?
Only that the issue had to be confronted one way or another. But obviously if it could be confronted differently and peacefully, that would be better. My view was always that if you built a strong enough international coalition, then it was possible to avoid military action. It was even possible, actually, to either to get rid of the regime or change its nature fundamentally, if the international community stayed together.
Blair was trying to repeat the Kosovo strategy, threaten war to avoid war. But some in the Bush administration saw little point in trying to build a coalition for Iraq. John Bolton was in charge of arms control.
It was clear, I think, from very early on, that France and Russia, at a minimum, had difficulty with the idea of using military force against Saddam Hussein for commercial reasons, for geopolitical reasons, for whatever reason.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney were particularly impatient with British diplomacy.
President Bush at least had an understanding of the difficulties that this decision was giving us politically, but you did have this sense that Cheney and Rumsfeld were in somewhat of a different place, and really, whether Britain was there or not, well.
It was over Israel that tensions first emerged. For Blair, progress on the Arab-Israel dispute was vital if the international coalition in the war on terror was to hold together.
For me, the Middle East peace process was always absolutely fundamental to this, because you had to be able to show to the Arab and Muslim world that this was not just about us protecting us. If we wanted that broad coalition, we could ignore the fact that for the Arab and Muslim world, this was absolutely in the soul of their being.
Many in Washington saw it differently.
Now, I'm not sympathetic to that point of view at all. If Israel disappeared from the map of the Middle East tomorrow, as some want to see happen, the conflicts within Islam and the radical Islamic patterns of behavior that we've seen over the last 10 years would continue unabated, because it's not Israel that really motivates them. It's the fundamentalist view they take of Islam as a religion and their hatred of the West and the United States in particular.
When world leaders met at the G8 in Canada in June 2002, disagreements were already growing over Israel. 2 days earlier, Bush had called on the Palestinians to remove their leader, Yasser Arafat.
I wouldn't exactly call myself the skunk at the picnic, but I think there was a fair amount of consternation at this result of the speech I gave him, which in essence said that, we won't be dealing with Arafat.
That meeting in Canada was difficult. Everyone, including myself, was saying, look, George, he's their leader and you've got to work with it, and that's that. I remember there's quite a sharp exchange of views around the informal dinner conversation that we had on this issue.
It was clear the Middle East peace process was not a priority for the Bush administration. For Blair, it now became vital to succeed in the second part of the two-pronged strategy he'd developed to bind the international community together. He had to persuade Bush to take the Iraq issue to the UN. In July, he dispatched his senior foreign policy advisor to Washington.
Prime Minister made it absolutely clear in the message that I was instructed to deliver in the summer of 2002 that if the President chose to deal with this unilaterally, that was fine. What we're saying is if you do want us to be with you, we will have to go the UN route, and we would like the UN route to work.
Foreign Secretary Jack Straw was simultaneously delivering the same message to Colin Powell. The US Secretary of State was one of the few in the Bush administration who shared Blair's view of the importance of the UN.
Colin Powell and I formed an extremely close bond, and we're on the same page on issues. And we were working very actively indeed to try to secure a diplomatic solution. We were working extremely hard with the multilateral system to try to avoid military action.
But by now, all the talk in the media was of war. In August 2002, Bush and Blair spoke on the phone.
I remember a conversation when I was on holiday in France and spoke to him, and there was sort of fever pitch in the American media and indeed parts of the British media about imminent military action, and him actually saying to me, you know, they're all going to calm down. I mean, you know, we haven't figured this thing out yet.
It was time they did figure it out. A couple of weeks later, in early September, the two men met at Camp David for the second of their key meetings on the road to war.
The point about the September 2002 meeting was that it was really about the United Nations. Did we go down that route or not? And in the end, there was quite a discussion about it. And I mean, I certainly felt that it was resolved that we would go back to the UN.
I thought that Blair was responding to pressure from the left in the Labour Party. The idea of going back to the Security Council was a waste of time and potentially had with very negative implications if we couldn't get a clear resolution.
Despite the objections from his own team, Bush had agreed to take the UN route. But the president had also reached a vital understanding with Blair.
I think he was a little concerned as to whether or not I recognized how important it was to utilize the United Nations as a way to rally support, and I assured him that I wasn't, but I also assured him that sometimes you can get stuck in the United Nations to no end, and that at some point in time, if we get stuck, he and I, along with others, may have to say, well, enough's enough. Something has to happen. And he confirmed that he understood that was the case, and that gave me great, that helped me realize I wasn't going to the UN alone, for example, and wouldn't be the only guy saying, wait a minute, enough is enough. Thank you all.
Bush was in no doubt about the significance of the commitment he'd obtained from Blair.
Bush just sort of called me over and said, I'll say this, your guy's got cojones.
Which translates as?
Why don't you pull up your English-Spanish dictionary?
I thought it was a Spanish beer, but I subsequently discovered it. It meant balls.
It was now explicitly understood. If the UN route failed, Britain would stand by America, even if it meant war. Some of Blair's closest foreign policy advisors felt he had given away Britain's best bargaining chip too cheap, too early.
David Manning and others felt that the Prime Minister might have laid one part of the two-part message on too thick and the other part too thin. It had to be got across that we wanted Saddam dealt with and we would be with the Americans if force was used, and the Prime Minister was adamant about that, but they didn't want force to be used. And the second part of that came across to the Americans less strongly than the first part.
Blair didn't like to use leverage. He preferred to use persuasion. I think some of us felt that there might have been occasions when he could have used more leverage.
Even Colin Powell was frustrated that Blair did not take a tougher line with Bush.
Colin Powell said, in the end, Blair would never lie down on the railroad tracks. Jack Straw and I would get him all pumped up about an issue, and he'd be ready to say, look here, George, but as soon as he saw the president, he would lose all steam.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a view which is that, I didn't really believe in this action, and therefore, at some point, I should have been prepared to say, look, I'm not going to do this unless you do X, Y, and Z. I mean, it wasn't a bargaining chip for me. It was what I believed, and I still do believe it. You see, the trouble is maybe, and I can't answer this, maybe some others didn't believe in it. I believed in it. I wasn't in a position where I was negotiating with him in order to get him to do something different. In my view, if it wasn't clear that the whole nature of the way Saddam was dealing with this issue had changed, I was in favor of military action. I was going to be arguing for military action. I'm afraid it's in one sense, is kind of worse than people think, as far as my position is concerned.